All right, we're live. This is StriderTalk, episode number 9. This is Matt
Woo.
Krotz, and I'm hanging out with my friend John Matos. How you doing,
Hello. It's going to be hard not to touch my face.
John? Yep.
I've been trying to prevent myself from doing that, but it's kind of like my nervous tick. I scratch
Yeah.
a little bit my beard, and I wipe my nose.
Well,
Anyway.
I think this self-quarantining thing that a lot of cities are doing is it's actually going to be more effective than anything, more than
Yeah.
covering your face and that sort of thing.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
those, I don't know if there's anybody listening that isn't in the States, but in the States, it seems like mostly businesses are like, or employers, I should say, are opting to say, like, if you can work from home, please do. And then I don't know if it was recently like state mandated or something, but my company specifically said, like, it's a mandatory thing now. Please work from home if you're non-essential staff. Um, but it seems like at least here it's not as dire in the sense that there's about around 2,000 cases, but um, usually if you can catch it early enough, then things aren't very disastrous. So we appreciate that blessing. We know uh, it's
Yeah.
not working out that way for everybody out there. So our prayers
Yeah.
go out to you guys.
I saw an interesting take. I saw someone say the lack of testing will probably work out to be a good thing because people have freaked out so much because of it that we've
Right, that's what I was
actually
thinking. Is that
severely
like
compensated to protect ourselves better
right.
probably than easier access to testing would have. So we've alarmed ourselves into a state of readiness that we otherwise probably wouldn't have, which I think is kind of an interesting take. I mean, that's probably glass half full. A lot of people aren't ready for that, but we'll see in a few weeks if that
Yeah,
does
because I
continue.
was thinking about like my you know um, optimism was thinking like, well, if people overcompensate, then it's probably better for everybody, and then
Yeah,
hopefully, um, there can be things like vaccines soon, and
yeah,
that the actual half life of this crazy thing will dissipate shortly. Um,
hmm
but we thank
yeah,
you all for tuning in. And,
yeah. We've got your sisters in the chat. Hi, Melissa.
oh, ha. Hello, Bish.
A couple
Um,
other quiet folks, but yep. So yeah, so tonight, so you had the great idea to talk about dark fantasy and The
mm,
Witcher being a nice showcase of that.
mm.
So
Aha, yes. So I chose it for twofold reasons. One, I started ranting about it last episode, and I
oh yeah,
figured it kind of deserved more to talk about. Secondly, I think it's good to kind of talk about how you think of Kyrie as like a fantasy work, because I feel like
hmm.
everybody kind of has their idea of what they're writing, and when you have a like supernatural element, um, there's a way that you want to talk about that to let people know, hey, it's this type of thing, so that your readers, your fans that are ready to like your thing will get what it is. Um, so,
Yeah.
oh yeah. So, if you do you have a take on that before we talk about dark fantasy
Gosh.
specifically?
Well, I'm still trying to. I mean, as you know, I say Indiana Jones and Ancient Rome, and
Uh,
I lead with that
it's a
because
strong elevator pitch, if I can say.
yeah, it rhymes, and I think it does the trick. Uh,
Uh,
and I've learned sword and sandal. Other people said that, and then I realized that's a genre. And
mm,
but I knew about sword and sorcery. And last week you did mention sword and sandal and sorcery, and
mm,
how that might be a way to go about it. And I'm kind of workshopping that now. So
mm.
hopefully, maybe that does get across the. I don't have any sorcerers. Well, I kind of do. Yeah, I probably should be
See,
using.
that's what
So
I'm saying. So the first thing I can take from The Witcher and where I am right now with fantasy at large, because I was a fan of Lord of the Rings, majorly a fan of the
Of
films, and
course.
then I think I read all of the books before the third movie came out. So I was reading like Fellowship and Two of Towers concurrently when those movies came out, but then Return of the Kings is a little bit shorter, so I was able to get that one
Yeah.
done for that movie. And I fell in love with that series. I loved what Tolkien did with that. I grew up reading the Chronicles of Narnia, but neither of those really turned me on to reading fantasy novels as a like that wasn't like a thing. I guess I fell into more comics in
Mm.
general.
Yeah.
But then like I've mentioned in previous episodes, like I went from comics to more like the indie comics route and more of like out there kind of sci-fi or horror like Walking Dead. Um,
Sure.
but then I kind of found myself like, okay, I'm gonna go to more like this literary fiction thing, and I liked more of like gothic or just novels that were about everyday life or if I do dip into sci-fi, I like things like the Southern Reach trilogy. That's much more literary. It's not really like um,
Mm.
related to fantasy very much. It's not like a Star Wars type of fantasy or sci-fi
Yeah.
thing.
Sure.
But the two things I was thinking of, and I just pitched this to Melissa not too long before starting, is that like I feel like there are people on two sides of this coin where you think of fantasy, you might think of something like Superman, or like,
Mm.
how can I relate to this thing? It's just about this, Boy Scout white knight person in a very outlandish situation, and that's not my thing. And
Yeah.
so you can think of the way that I coined that was like an empirical power fantasy, where it's literally like this person is a strong man character, and if they might like have a
Yeah.
moment of weakness, but it's really just about them getting the strength to get the gold from the dragon's lair and bring it back home
I
and
think I
share
think
it.
that's kind of the argument around DC Comics in general, if I'm not mistaken,
Right,
versus
right.
probably where you're going, which would look more like a Marvel Comics
Hmm.
approach. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that I feel like so there's two sides of that coin. Is that
Yeah.
like I feel like there are people that think, oh, this is a fantasy, so I can have a little bit of escapism, and so they
Mm.
actually and Melissa had actually referred to like something like um, the Phantom of the Opera. There's this
Mm.
thing of
Hmm.
like there's a cathartic feeling that you get every time you watch this show, and it's not necessarily that there's not very much in the way of like tension especially after you've seen it once. There's just kind of like you experience this as a spectacle thing, and it gives you the same feeling every time you watch or read that, and you go back to that for that reason. You can think of the same
Mm.
about like somebody like Sherlock, who is a kind of larger than life, um, more real character, but there's still that feeling of like comfort there. Um, or you can think of it as like, oh, this is kind of like a cookie cutter, two-dimensional thing. Versus what I was thinking
Hmm.
of with the other side is that you can have something that has a lot of dramatic irony. So you think of like Les Miserables, or I was thinking the biggest fantasy example recently is Game of Thrones, where like every
Yep.
character, like Sansa wants to be the princess and she wants to have all of this like stuff just handed to her, and so when she tries to get that, it's actually like her father is killed in front of her, and she has to give up all of this stuff to get some bastardized version of her childhood dream. And so
Mm. Hmm.
it's almost like the way that what's his name, George R. R. Martin sees it is that like it's so ironic that it's bordering on cruel irony, and so you get this thing of
Yeah.
like nobody really gets what they want in this fantasy story, but it is the tension is that you're assuming that it might make the victory of the good guys, whatever there are remaining at the end of the story, that much sweeter if they're put through this kind of like crucible together. Um, so
Yeah.
on the one hand, you have people that prefer things that are a little bit darker that way, and that that are a little bit more punishing, because then it is more cathartic for them. But then you
Yeah,
also, and I tend to vacillate. It's why I'm kind of bringing it up, between this thing of like, well, I'm done just watching, Superman cry like in Man of Steel or Batman vs Superman. That's not Superman. Like, I want the fantasy elements of it to be more prominent. Um,
yeah.
but
And
then,
I'm sure it seems to me like the the Game of Thrones format. I think there was a risk uh, that they took to perhaps. I think a lot of people were watching it expecting a cathartic release, even by the very end, up
mhm,
through the last season. They were expecting some sort of this will all be worth it because I'm going to get exactly what I need. There's a couple characters who absolutely are immune to the themes of this story, and I'm going to
mhm,
see them overcome even that, even the very flavor of the narrative. I'm going to see them overcome with it, and they don't,
uh-huh,
which I saw coming seasons ago, but um,
uh-huh,
they don't, and I was even well, I don't know. I say that, but I was a little surprised that they actually went that direction because by that point George R. R. Martin wasn't writing it so much. So I
mhm,
thought like maybe they were going to take more of a Hollywood approach and kind of
mhm.
give the fans what they wanted, but they never did. And um, yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to throw that caveat in because I saw a lot of
Well,
people in the workplace uh,
mhm,
just saying, no, 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 just wait till the next episode. Wait till the next
uh,
episode. Uh, our favorite characters are going to get everything they want. And I'm like, oh, I'm not sure thematically that has anything to do with
uh,
what we've
but
been
I think
seeing.
you bring up an interesting tension where you're saying, like, there's this thing of, if you're making something with the modern um, intention of making a franchise. What's interesting is that, like, you're talking about Hollywood. You make that analogy because this is something that is making HBO a lot of money. This is something that, like, is a book series. It kind of acts like a big commercial for George R. R. Martin. It
Yeah, and it needs
incentivizes
to
him.
sell DVD sales afterwards. People have to
Right.
like it enough to want to pass it on to their kids.
So yeah, so there's that interesting thing of, like, you're supposed to be serving the audience, but like you're saying, there's an interesting thing with a dark fantasy thing
Mm.
where you're telling the person that there is something intentionally broken about this story. And
Yeah,
I think Game of Thrones is a good example, because
yeah,
I personally, like, I think with Daenerys's storyline, you think of, like, there was this kind of like lip service paid to the fact that, like, okay, her lineage is one of madness,
mm.
and you're thinking maybe there's this tension of, like, is she going to lose control? But then there's this overall thing of, like, well, the only people that she's hurting are people that, like, enslave others. Like, she just keeps, like,
Yeah,
like, she keeps ousting all of these, like, tyrants. So there's not really this feeling, like, she does a lot of messed up things, but I think people kind of questioned the turn at the end of the story as this, like, kind of, it seemed almost like anti fan service, and that, like, you're
hmm.
maybe people were hoping that she would overcome that instinct, or overcome this legacy, or everything. And
Yeah.
personally,
Contrary to what the show had taught them up to that point. But
right.
yeah,
And I feel
yeah,
like most of the tension was lost for me, because the whole season nobody really addressed any, like, it was a very odd thing where, like, it seemed like a whole season went by without anyone actually trying to contradict her, or trying to
yeah,
analyze what really the problem was. It just seemed like the showrunners knew, okay, she's going to go crazy in the last episode, and people are just going to kind of let her do it, and then, like, one or two people are going to say something, but it's not going to be, like, nobody's, like,
hmm.
I feel like it would have been satisfying if Jon Snow was, like, going to the army and saying, like, okay, if this happens, if things go the wrong way, then let's overthrow her or something.
Well, that's probably why so many people. That's a good point. Maybe that's why so many people were so let down by the end, was that
Mhm.
they were giving her a pass for so long that
Right.
people were just like emotionally invested, where they're like, I can give her a pass. She
Mhm.
hasn't. She will always have a reason for what she's doing that I can
Right.
justify.
That's
And
how I
and it
felt about
pushed
it.
it right off the cliff into now I can't justify it anymore, and I feel like uh, upset and maybe betrayed by this idea that I thought I could. You were telling me I could always justify it, and now
Right.
I no longer can, and I'm
And I
upset
felt like they were
with that.
setting up. I felt
Yeah,
like they were setting up John to be the
mm,
type of person who like, so they were playing this weird thing
yeah,
where like she was jealous of the fact that he was a natural
yeah,
leader, but he wasn't doing any leadership. It
yeah.
just
That's
people just
true.
kind of liked him and they were willing to do whatever he said, but then he never used that to his advantage or
Yeah,
um,
that was weird.
played
Yeah,
that card throughout the season until the point when it was most crucial for him to make a decision.
mm,
And so I felt like maybe they thought that surprise would be enough at the end. But
yeah.
anyway, a
It's a
little
good
bit off track, but I think it's a
good
good
analysis.
analogy to use for like what that is. But I
Yeah.
think the thing with the Witcher that got me when I watched the show, I was thinking, okay, this is another, well, I guess a good reference now to use is the Mandalorian, where
Hmm.
there's a character who's kind of like, okay, this person is very competent, and so you get that kind of power fantasy element where like they're super powerful and they can, they're it's kind of like this Wild West in a fantasy setting, um,
Mhm.
and but then there's this weird thing where like most fantasy stories, there is some kind of tension where the person is part of a prophecy or there's something there's some call from the numinous to like get
Mm.
out of their status quo and go on some kind of grand adventure. But with
Yeah.
a lot of these like assassin motivated stories like Assassin's Creed or like The Mandalorian or
Yeah. Or The
those
Witcher.
types
Yeah.
of things, there's
Hmm.
this idea that like this person is already a badass and they're already out there kicking monster tail. And
Hmm.
so I feel like it's a lot less tense when you start with something like that and there is no convincing reason for that person who is kind of this amoral character to go outside of their status quo because they're already like he's already earning money defeating monsters. Um, I felt like what I
Yeah.
liked about the short story, that's the first one was called The Witcher, and they've collected it. Actually, if I can share my screen real quick,
Yeah.
to do and the window. All right. Boop.
All right.
All right. So this is The Last Wish, and it's a collection of the short stories before the novel series of The Witcher came out. And so there's this overarching like frame story that kind
Hmm.
of loosely ties all the short stories together. But I really focused just on the first short story that introduces you to the character. It's about how Geralt goes into a town and he murders some local thugs, and then this king, first of all, there's this governor who's like, I could execute you, or you could help with this local problem where um, the king's bastard daughter turned into a Struger, I think was what they called him, and it's this kind of like
Yeah. Striger.
Baba
Yeah. Yeah.
Yaga type
Hmm.
witch monster thing, um, and uh, the idea being that like the king would prefer to take this creature alive, and there was a jester that in kind of like a darkly funny thing came up with this idea that if you sleep in the tomb for 3 nights or until a cock crows 3 times, then the princess will be saved and the curse will be reversed. Um, but and so it's this interesting um, what I feel like the tension was within the story was that you already know that this guy is in this society where criminals are like lashed to the outsides of, the walls, and basically monster food. And there's
Yeah.
very little in the way of like nobility that you would see in like a Tolkien-esque fantasy. But at the
Yeah.
same time, what I thought that the tension was, is this person going to go and just kill the monster so that he can earn the bounty, or is he going to try to cure it, try to
Hmm.
find out some kind of clever way to get the rescue the princess? And because of how much of a kind of mercenary character this is, you're not really sure which he's going to do. Um, so
Yeah, and yet, like I do like there's something that caught my attention with the show was this idea pretty early on that he's exceptional in ability. I mean, it is like a straight like DC Comics power fantasy,
uh,
but he's he's very clearly mercenary, and yet like he's just as mercenary as he is sticking to particular principles that he hammers home every episode,
mm,
which is nice. So that you can, I suppose, it's like you're trying to work out through the course of the plot and his situations, like where those tensions lie between whether or not he's willing to do something that he thinks to be immoral. Like, where does his mercenary tactics have its limits? I guess,
mhm,
which are
right.
constantly tried, but because at the same time, like it's something. I guess it's something that a lot of people can relate to. It's like,
Mhm,
well, what if this guy wasn't just walking around like a superhero? What if he was just trying to get paid? But he
mhm,
also had a clear kind of authoritarian kind of I don't know what, like, trying not to make the world a worse place kind of moral center,
mhm,
and he's clinging to both at the same time, like,
right.
and that puts him in every single situation that you find him in. Is he wants to get
Mhm,
paid and he wants to not not leave a place worse than he found it.
mhm.
So I kind of like I just wanted to put that in there.
Yeah. No, but yeah, but I think so. There's two things there. One, it's always interesting to me that tension. Like, I'm kind of on the fence about it because I feel like there's, with certain characters, you get this idea of like there's this there's this bottled rage, and
Mm,
sometimes they use this in kind of awkward ways because at some points the person is acting so belligerent that you're not, without knowing the reason why they're acting this way, you're kind of like, why am I watching this show about this guy that just like randomly murders people because he can? Um,
yeah,
but
yeah,
then I think what's interesting is that, like, so for example, I felt like, um, and it's kind of something I referenced before the show, that I really like how the new Bond series restarted itself, because there was this idea of like, okay, this
mm,
first movie isn't just going to show how cool Bond is so that people keep watching our franchise. It was
yeah,
like, this is why this character is this broken, because the one time that he did trust someone, they betrayed him, and now
yeah,
this kind of explains a little bit of why this character is the way that they are, and they're
yeah,
just that their only dedication is to this job because they know, at least I can do this. And what you get, the tension then that you get, is how much of that I can just leave things a little bit better than they were, are they willing to continue to do? Because in
hmm,
one sense, that's this deadening that you get this a lot with the Marvel, um, Netflix shows, that like, how much can one person do against this like fully corrupt system? Um, but then usually they have a good supporting cast of characters that convince them that, you know doing nothing is not an option, type of thing.
yeah,
Um, and so that,
yeah,
I feel like maybe there are some fantasy things, like Batman has this problem sometimes where they want
mm,
to kind of play things both ways, where they have a supportive cast, but they just like to screw off and do their own thing every now and then. Um,
yeah. No, I
and
agree with that. Yeah.
um, it's so maybe this might be a nice opportunity to talk about how you were thinking about because you were creating an outlaw character, what maybe some of the thoughts that went into how am I going to motivate this person to be involved in this bigger, like, mythic story? And if you were there
Hmm.
versions that were more like traditional and like noble, bright, kind of like Tolkien-esque, and were there versions, or were there versions where like it was darker and they were like stabbing people in the back and they were kind of like a Johnny Depp-esque, like, they'll betray anyone just to get ahead.
That's a really good question. I would say Han Solo really impacted me as a kid, and I really
Oh,
like
sure.
the idea of a character who appears, who wants to be known as a merely mercenary character, is trying to convince the audience that that's all he is in himself,
Uh,
but he can't help himself but slowly, over the course of being in, you know, um, in a relationship with like a Luke Skywalker type character who is underdeveloped in terms of experience, but has a intense, fits more of that hero's calling kind of mold, and is willing to take uh,
Excuse
to
me.
to take the call, that it actually kind of brings out the heroic in the mercenary, and so that's what Myra is. Um, and she's played off against Marcus, and I guess I take a lot of cues from I'm gonna bring up something.
Aha.
I think I've mentioned this guy to you before. Jonathan Truby.
Mm-hmm.
He's a story doctor type person, and well, this is his really boring website, but it's something visual to look at.
Yeah, I think so. I've listened to a couple people on YouTube that do um store, like, a lot of them are like to analyze screenplays.
Oh
So I
yeah,
think I've heard them quote him a couple dozen times.
yeah, he's really good, and he suggests don't think about your characters. It's not like writing a bio sheet for these characters and then just kind of shuffling them around, and then just picking your favorites. Like you're
Mm-hmm.
building, like, I don't know, the Magic the Gathering deck. Well, even that wouldn't. That actually proves my point. Even if you were going to build a deck, you have to build, each card has to work in light of each other, right?
Right,
So
right.
these characters are actually defined in light of each other. You think about a very solitary, a film franchise that's built around a single character, supposedly, like Indiana Jones. Well,
Mm-hmm.
the first Indiana Jones and Raiders is not the same Indiana Jones that you see in Temple of Doom or in Crusade, because each of his supporting cast is bringing out different dimensions of him, right? So you kind of have to figure out what the theme is, what your moral vision is for the story, and where you want to explore. And then you have to actually write characters that fit together expressly for the point of driving that particular theme home. If you want to write a father-son story, you can take the Temple of Doom actually does that in a way, and also Crusade. So you have to deal with, do you want to focus more on what it's like to be a son
Mm-hmm.
with a broken relationship with a father, or do you want to deal with, is it, what's it more like to be a father with a broken relationship with a son?
Right.
And you're going to take one of two routes, and you can't just shuffle them around. So that's kind of something for me. And then also, I guess, Legolas and Gimli are my two
Uh,
favorite.
oh,
Um,
nice.
and again, that's like, these aren't just characters that sit on their own. Like, they bring out particular things that
Mm-hmm.
uh, make the story unique because of their relationship. The relationship is more than the sum of their
Right.
parts. So I do that with two of the characters in the book as well, because I really love them. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that um the penchant to maybe micromanage characters in isolation
Hmm.
can sometimes, you can get into these like mental, like, whirlpools where you think, okay, well, I have, like, so somebody who is really good at writing character, like very stridently idealistic characters is Aaron Sorkin. a lot of
Hmm.
his screenplays are written as if like this person stands for this idea, and then this person stands for this idea, but rather than just work on these two things like a creative nonfiction essay, the whole point of it is that you throw these people into conflict and the ideas that you get. So it's a very Socratic method. You really like get the
Yeah.
most revelation in their characters by putting them in conflict with each other.
Yes.
And you see, is this going to be a tragedy because they can never see eye to eye? Is it going to be a romance because it happens to be two opposites like Han and Leia who think that they hate each other but really are most compatible because they challenge each other to be better.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and that's a challenge. I think. Hmm. Like if you don't have a clear view of how that's gonna be the driving element of your story, then you're not gonna be able to write exciting dialogue because and the dialogue isn't really gonna push the characters into from the beginning to the end, like in the sort of directions you want them to go in, because you're not thinking about those relationships being the fuel and the momentum for how they're going to change over the course of the story. If you
right,
want the characters to change over the course of the story by virtue of their relationships, then that's gonna ignite your each and every scene to kind of help progress the characters towards that end, and it's going to focus the dialogue so it's not just plot. Um, it's not they're not just explaining things to the audience, they're actually working out grievances or passions or they're working out conflicts
right,
each and every single scene with no exception.
right,
So yeah.
right. Yeah, and I think that's the biggest challenge is that, like, for example, I really like dialogue, and I was saying what I respected with your comic was that there was a very poetic moment, but it's not like, oh, you discovered I'm good at writing this thing, let me just pepper that out throughout the throughout the book.
No thanks.
So I feel like with that, like personally, I really like enjoy writing dialogue.
Yeah.
I think that I think a mistake you could make is, like, for example, like people will talk about this a lot with action movies. They'll say like, well, I remember they went to Mozambique and um, Italy, and it ended at the Eiffel Tower or something, and you
Mm.
really see that it's just like, okay, we have these locations, let's show off what our money can buy, but really like, I guess you could think of like Gemini Man. I heard that a lot about. Like, it just looked very much like this was a spectacle driven thing, and the story just was not compelling enough to get people to care. First of all, to go see the movie, let alone review it well when they went to see it. So
Yeah.
there's this feeling of like, I'm moving this from one um, generic location to the next, and
Mm.
if I spend enough time just on this one aspect of the production, be it that you're a writer who is producing like pretty sounding words, or you're an artist making nice pictures or what have you, if it's not driven by drama, then it's not going to feel good. So that's, I think, to
Mm.
bring it back to the beginning,
Yeah.
because like for example, like I think it's good to think of it in terms of arguments, but also when you're thinking about just action, if the action does not have some kind of pivotal climax, if there's not tension throughout
Mm.
the action scene, you're not going to get what you want. And you so in the case of a dark fantasy story, if you were literally just peppering your story with gross out horror, body horror, different things that don't really have any connection to the reader, like the reader doesn't have any reason to trust that you're taking this in a certain direction. It could just be like real static things like, okay, this is this gross werewolf, and this is this person chasing it, and there's nothing that is you're trying to surprise just with how you know shocking the word choice that you're using is, but there is no, if there's actually no connection that your reader has with the characters, then they're not gonna, number one, they're not gonna like the thing that you're making, but they're also not gonna trust you with the next story that you have, because
Hmm.
they're not trusting that you have something to give them that they can't get just somewhere else with another piece of art, um and so
Yeah, that's a really fair criticism. Yeah, yeah, and I think it's so interesting. Like this ties. I think you're making me realize I've never thought about this before, but this probably ties into the human factor of successfully marketing
oh sure.
storytelling in the indie market in general. Just like you can't hook someone to come back for more without a high, like a, I still don't know what to call it, but like a humanity factor within the story.
Mhm.
You can't get people to buy your indie fiction without a high human element of your marketing,
Mm.
which I think is pretty interesting. It still goes back to this clear kind of interesting idea of humans are still being human,
Mm.
thankfully, despite
Right.
how much technology we're around. We're just finding ways to warp it to fit something that most closely approximates just face-to-face human contact. So
Mhm.
whenever the stories are able to do that, even if it's just an action story. If it's telling something that seems compelling, if there's a layer that feels deeply human,
Mhm.
that's gonna rich and excite us for more action. And
Mhm.
it has to be sold by a creator who seems that we feel like we have a human dimensionality to that creator. You know what I mean? Like the
Mhm.
his or hers, like we can frame their sensibilities in our mind, whether that's from constant live streaming or it's from I don't know, meeting them at a con or
Mhm.
some
Yeah.
kind of transparency to who they are as a person
Right.
is
So
absolutely
I
vital.
think you strike on something great, that where I'm like, for example, like I really enjoy talking, so like I could do like a stream where I'm just like drinking. I like drinking orange juice in the morning, so I'll use that as an example.
Nice. Yeah,
I could just
sure.
drink a cup of orange juice in the morning and be with people, and maybe at some point in the future I'll choose to do more vlogs and live streams. But for
Yeah,
right now, I think it's more satisfying to people hear me talk to you and Melissa, because they're
yeah.
seeing this Socratic thing work out where two people have two different perspectives, and there is a sense of drama that you're getting by hearing two different creators. One is an indie author, another is a comics author and cartoonist. um, like there's different things that are interesting to learn, and if you
Hmm.
just think of it in terms of like I had said that before about like, just think of it like information, and you're just kind of dumping things out there. I think that's one thing that I like about the vlogs that you've been doing, where there's I can tell it's kind of stressful for you to make them, but you have this thing where you're trying to work things out that are complex to talk about, and they're not. You realize that there is a certain amount of what people call drama that is not really dramatic, because you know what that person's going to say. Like if they say, "I side with this person,"
Mm.
you might as well not watch, because you know that. Or it can go to what your characters are like. You wanted to describe them, and I think you thought it was interesting to talk about, like you said, this bit of information you learned where the characters work better in tandem with each other. So it was interesting to watch, because I could tell that you were interested in making the video. So
Hmm.
that
I didn't realize you already saw that, so I feel bad. I just
Oh no,
repeated
that's fine.
myself on this thing.
So the people need to know. But I feel like that's like the if you were still excited to say it, it's weird, because as an individual, it can feel like redundant because of just how much stuff you pump out into the ether, and it has this weird feeling of like, I'm dumping all this information into a black hole. You're not
Yeah.
you're not getting the same feedback that you would if you were just speaking in front of a live audience. But it
Yeah.
really,
That's fair.
like you're saying, like that same tension can come across in how you present yourself as a creator, because you want people to be thinking of how can we improve fiction, how can we improve our communication skills, and there's a bit of it that is trying to ask a question and get feedback from an audience, and it's not
Yeah.
just because there's a lot of more technology and access doesn't mean that we're done with storytelling. It's all the same process
Yeah.
the same well we keep going back to.
Yeah, because it's definitely there's a begin there. You're not making good videos. You're not making good content. We're not doing good with StriderTalk unless we're telling a story just in our conversation. This is a dialogue moment, a particular scene runs about an hour long, and we have a beginning, middle, and end, and we're arriving at a destination by the end, and hopefully we've learned, our characters, our respective characters have learned something over the course, or we've gotten closer to having our needs met at the end, and hopefully the audience feels the same way, which is exciting. I think that's really, it's just more storytelling, like you say. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And I think one last thing that The Witcher brought to mind for me, because there's an interesting part of a scene where The Witcher is talking. First of all, he's a lot more expressive when he's talking in the short story as opposed to the show, because it's playing on what you're saying, like later on in the series. You're saying develops more, where like you're starting to see that there are, like, he has a moral code that he's trying to. He knows where his line is, and
what jobs he will not take.
right. And in the short story, that's delineated by the fact that, like, he's very respectful in terms of, like, he may not personally respect the people that he's working for, and you're not really sure how much he cares about. He's like, he doesn't want a knighthood, and then the one thing they keep throwing in his face, that like he could marry the princess if he rescues her, and he multiple times he says, like, I'm not really interested in that. But one of the things that he says is that when the guy asks, do you think that this reversal of the curse will work, and he says this thing like, that's only for the knowing ones to know, like, and then there's that group that are like sorcerers within the lore. But as a Witcher, he only cares about what magic he can use to survive. And I thought that was interesting, because what it did was it showed, like, that there is magic in this world, but unlike something like, say, like Superman, it didn't seem like it was very arbitrary. It's not just like, oh, when he's soaking up the rays of the sun, he can convert that into superpowers, and then that's it. There was an irony attached to the fact that, like, there are people in this world that use magic to survive, and then there are people who actually understand how that magic works, and there's like class distinction between those people and people that just use it in like a folk sense.
I think that appeals, just quickly, like, I think that's one thing that people like about The Witcher, is that he's a very working class superhero type character.
Right.
And he appeals to, and probably in like a post-religious culture where we feel like maybe the priests and sorcerers of this age are people have a low view of their moral character, I suppose, or they like stories that demonstrate them to be as such. It's nice to see someone who seems maybe not agnostic, but he's not religiously tied to his powers per se. I guess it's more and even like what he's doing and what the world that he comes from, why he exists, is more of a working class kind of mindset where it's like, well, let's do this sorcery just to create uh, a guy who can, people who can function in a very particular way for a job for money.
Right.
Like it just feels like a blue collar kind of approach, I guess,
Right.
to the
Right.
world, which I think makes it very accessible, and people
Mhm.
like his cynicism. Uh, so yeah, all that tied together, I think it resonates really well with like a 21st century audience that
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
can entirely appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think initially what I was reticent about was that I read after watching the first episode and kind of being on the fence about it. I read what the author said about the series, and he was saying that it's a very apolitical character, and
Yeah.
I think my post religious sense in terms of that as a phenomenon, I was thinking, well, okay, this is just another character who is not just amoral but immoral with the excuse of the fact that there is a an unevenness to life, and they get to do
Hmm.
whatever they want basically and just blame the fact that there's injustice, right? But so
Yeah.
that's my cynical take on it at first. But then
No,
I was
yeah,
thinking,
there's an element of that. I do think you're right.
mhm.
That is part of the appeal.
But I think what might save it and interesting just about the period that we are in of post religious things and how that ties into fantasy works. Well, there actually no, there's a couple things. One is that like I feel like a lot of the well, anyway, I'll get into that later. There's a
Yeah,
historical
yeah.
thing I'll bring up, but I think just for the sake of the show, there's an interesting thing of um, you. Oh, so I've been thinking about this because I had an Uber driver the other day that was when I got in the car, he was like proselytizing Buddhism to the person in the back seat, and
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
when that person left, I asked him like, "Do you think that you have like a personal relationship with God? Like, what do you think of
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
distinction?" Because I was saying I just was already thinking of meditating on this verse. I was thinking about how Christ says, you can say anything against the Son of Man, but don't blaspheme the Holy Spirit. And I was saying, like, there's this weird, if you want to hold that verse in tension with, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, there's this interesting, like, almost like dark joke that Christ is saying, where it's like, listen, there's something that, like, one day people are going to be worshiping in spirit and in truth, and things are going to be a lot different than you go to your distinct place of worship, and that there's this like very ethnic thing about like how you're worshiping. It just there's going to be a time when things are different that way, and I
Hmm.
feel like right now, like you're saying, with this anti-religious kind of like zeitgeist,
Yeah.
if you really ask people, you ask them like, well, are you spiritual? Most people are very comfortable saying, oh yeah, no, I think there's something out there. Don't I'm not crazy. Like I know
Yeah.
that there's something weird about this world. So it's a very interesting thing that we almost find ourselves at this like interesting crossroad where a lot of characters are written like this, where there is a touch of the mythic to them, and
Hmm.
the way
Mm-hmm.
that I expressed it when I was making my notes was that like you can make stories where the magic is mysterious, and like the person isn't, for example, like or even I guess if you want to talk about like Avatar: The Last Airbender, that character somehow is tied to the fact that he has this legacy of power that is within him, but when the story begins, he doesn't really want to accept that. He isn't like he isn't enlightened in the sense that he's already reached, the nth of his abilities. He's just kind of like a kid, and the whole story is about him accepting the fact that he has all this kind of like magic power, right? Um, but
Yeah.
there is this interesting play now that we're getting, and you see it a lot, especially in like Game of Thrones and The Witcher, where like there is this sense of a spirituality and a supernatural realm, or these powers that you don't feel connected to. But
Mm.
the tension comes from the fact that like you can't deny that sense, and people are in this kind of tension with the fact that that is there, that exists, and they don't know necessarily how to access that. And so
Yeah.
one of the, I think, ways of explaining that is kind of like what The Witcher does, where
Mm.
there is a certain class that has that distinction, or, you know, if you want to be optimistic about it, they think that they have that power. They think that they have the rights to what is the orthodoxy, and then there's a lower class who have their own ways, and there's a kind of like folk understanding of, you know, spiritual world or the
Yeah.
magical world.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting. Um, one last point on my part
Mm-hmm.
is one of the things I enjoy about late antiquity
Uh-huh.
history is that it's kind of I think it's one reason why people kind of fix a particular time in history around the 7th century when things you can put like a before and after period in the history books, and it has to do with like when the majority of the world outside of Asia, just like west of China, so much more than just Europe, much more than just quote unquote Western, but the
Mm-hmm.
majority of the world became instead of having a cyclical view of history, began to start adopting uh, competing linear views
Mm-hmm.
with a beginning, middle, and end of history that they were anticipating.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting, and we even if we're in a post formally religious world now, for the most part, people are, like as you say, pretty spiritual, and there's I think there's tension at play between whether or not the zeitgeist is going to go lean more in a direction of preserving something that they had from their religious legacy, which is this linear framework of things
Mm-hmm.
progressing towards an ultimate utopian conclusion or an apocalyptic, just a mere apocalyptic, um, devastating destruction conclusion, or are we going to return to something that's more of a cyclical outlook, a pre-Western religion outlook, and I think it's kind of interesting to see that sort of play out. I think The Witcher is would be an example of just um, it's agnostic on that front, and I think people do enjoy that in some ways. And I think even in our storytelling, I guess you can see it because you can look at Game of Thrones, and the only way to end Game of Thrones is to have everyone die and everything to be destroyed, which is kind of like that linear approach of
Mm-hmm.
that's it has to go that way. We have to get to the end by having that happen. So I don't know. I think that's really interesting
Mm-hmm.
to see
Yeah.
people kind of struggle through that, I guess, in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's it's interesting what what the different reactions were to how Game of Thrones happened, and then
Yeah.
I think it'll be definitely a part of this channel going forward, where you're seeing, because of the success of Game of Thrones as a series, we're going to have an adaptation of the Wheel of Time coming shortly.
Ooh,
And
yeah.
I think a little bit later than that, there's going to be that Second Age adaptation of Lord of the Rings, more about like Sauron's rise.
Yeah.
Um, and so it'll be interesting. Like there seemed to be that Game of Thrones hype, and then that their Dungeons and Dragons has this kind of renaissance, and so you're
Yeah.
seeing fantasy as something that's just more water cooler conversation than it had been in the 90s, and it was kind of on the rise with Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Um,
And we're getting a Narnia world too,
oh, really?
supposedly on Netflix, but I doubt they're ever gonna. Yeah, that's been signed on since 2017 or so, but
Oh, okay.
Everyone's
Yeah.
looking for their version of uh, Game of Thrones, and this should be Netflix's. That was the idea, at least when they
Oh, okay.
bought the
Yeah,
franchise
I
in
hadn't heard of that
2016.
because I had
Yeah.
heard way back in the day. I think around that time, 2016, 2017, that
Hmm.
they were working on the Tolkien film, and then, but I think it was being billed as a Tolkien and Lewis movie. And then I guess
Yeah.
it just kind of changed over the different, versions of the script, or maybe just changing production hands, and then it wound up just being a Tolkien piece more generally about him and some of the early Inklings people. Um,
Yeah.
and so, but anyway, I think it's interesting as fantasy develops how we have like this weird influence of realism being like seeping into it, and so
Mm.
like people are kind of like there's this tension of like, well, how much of this is worth preserving, but then how much like it's one thing that I thought was interesting about the I forget who the lecturer was, but in talking about the Inklings, he was saying like the reason why goth literature is so strange is because like the Victorian era was just really stifling of any kind of like talk of like the numinous, and like there was
Mm.
kind of like idea of like when you can't rely on institutional um, expressions of the spiritual, there's just kind of like this. It's just gonna pop out in like weird ways, which
Yeah.
is kind of his take on it.
Which is
Um,
probably a good explanation of where we are today.
yeah,
That stuff
I
was
don't know
supposed to
his take.
be in our past, and that's precisely why it's in our present.
Mm.
Yeah.
But I feel like it would be interesting just to talk about maybe at some point, maybe the next episode or sometime later, the just realism on its own. Because
Mm.
one of my interpretations of it is like in reading things like reading a lot of like Hemingway and reading Yeats and some of these like
Mm. Hmm.
people like just dealing with like you know deep war times, and just like they're they're trying very much to just do impressionistic works of their lived in experience. There's this interesting thing of like they kind of have to mythologize themselves, and that like what I am seeing is unique to me, and like everyone that I hate is like a demon, and everything that I love is like an angel. And like it's a very interesting idea, because if you think if you were going to take the completely materialistic like angle and things, you would think that most of this stuff would enact itself as regression, and like people just need to accept the fact that we're like animals, and all this, you know, like what
Mm.
you said about like we're all monkeys that are uh, suffering from hubris and everything. Um,
Yeah.
but but it's just interesting that a lot of that, like some of the most beautiful of Edgar Allan Poe's poetry, is that he's like, you know, crazed out of his mind, and he looks at a cloud and it looks like a demon, and it's like, where, like, how is this stuff, like, what is this, like, what's happening? Um, and so, yeah, but
Mm.
a lot of that stuff, just as a religious person growing up and reading some of these stories, it was always interesting to me that, like, oh, so, like, Tolkien writing fantasy is doing he's like interpreting it just through the lens of ancient folklore, but then people that are just writing realistic prose, they have to imbue it with this sense of wonder, and oftentimes that expresses itself with very impressionistic writing that, like, to me reads like a mythic story. They're just doing it through their own perception. um,
Yeah.
but
I like that. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's food for thought.
Hmm. Hmm.
Anything that you want to plug before we head out? Any other
Oh,
thoughts?
wow. I'll bring up my campaign. Thanks for asking.
Yes. Haha.
Um, yeah, I think we're doing pretty good. So So, as people probably know by now, I decided to crush the system and make the system work for me, not work for the system. So, we're just running the campaign until we raise enough funds and having fun doing it. We're close. You can see here we're almost to 50% with between Indiegogo and Kickstarter. And once we reach the printing fees, then we can just go ahead and print. We can print the same week, which is pretty exciting. And because the book's already done, with the exception of a couple pages, which I'm probably going to be finishing tonight or this week at least. And yeah, we're having fun, and a couple people did some fan art sort of stuff. So we're gonna try and print that in the book as well. And yeah, it's just been good. So still enjoying it. It is exhausting, but I tell you, it's one of those things where once the campaign's over and you fulfill everything, well, there's a certain stress when the campaign's over, but you haven't fulfilled everything. But then, and you're just like waiting on pins and needles for everything to get to your house. But then once you send everything out, there's a certain I don't know what you call it. It's a very sad denouement when it's over, and you're always looking for the next one. So I couldn't wait to set this campaign on the trail as soon as possible, and it's working so far. Yeah. So.
Oh, and something I can say in your, as both an I guess it's infotainment now. What we're doing,
Yeah.
the something that I think is interesting about your story, and it reminds me of something I learned. It's something I learned to define how my mom sees fantasy, because my dad was the person that introduced me to sci-fi and fantasy. He was a big fan of like really cheesy sci-fi movies like Tremors and Godzilla and all of those like 50s and on sci-fi franchises. And he grew up reading Conan the Barbarian.
Oh, neat, yeah.
And comics like that. But my mom has this thing where, and I didn't know what it was, but she would say like, oh, so for example, she watched the original Lord of the Rings cartoon, and she was just like, I don't get any of this. It's weird and stupid. But then when she saw the films, she was like, oh, okay, I finally understand what this is, what this means, and it finally hit her, right? So I found out there's a French word called donner, and I don't know literally what it means, but figuratively, the purpose of it in terms of fiction is it's that thing that someone has to get over in order to like your thing. So, for example, if you're like, oh, Lord of the Rings has elves, and the minute somebody hears elves or realm or magic or something, their brain just like shuts off and they can't deal with that thing, right?
Yeah.
So I think personally, like what I like about KYRIE is that like I have a thing about historical fiction where a person gets so lost in the details of like, and there's a lot of like, I need to prove that I went to school and got a master's degree in this thing, and so I'm going to insert all of this stuff. But there's a way in which your world is very, it just feels like its own thing, almost as if you created the landscape of ancient Rome just to fit your story. Like it really just feels like a world that you created. So I feel like I feel like if somebody found KYRIE, they don't have to worry about this being some kind of stuffy, like, doctorate slipped into a comic form. It's a very accessible and fun world in and of itself. And that's just a nice way of talking about another fantasy and sci-fi thing that sometimes people have problems with.
That's a good point, and thank you for saying that. Yeah, I really think the number one thing about telling a period piece and fantasy in a way you can talk of as a period piece being that you have to it's not populating it with facts and figures. It's just finding a way to saturate your story in a particular mood and feeling.
Mhm.
And if you have a very clear sense of what that the flavor of the world is, and you can keep to that with every scene and with every character, then you've created a believable world. I guess you don't have. It's not about writing an encyclopedia. It's about just having a strong taste for what that is and be able to find having a palate for it, you know, and be able to find things that actually enhance that sort of palate, which I think is the challenge of every fantasy writer. Where are you right now with your story? So you've kind of moved off. You've moved off webtoons. Is that correct?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm not on there right now. I
Mhm.
keep saying I'm gonna post short stories, but I'll let you all know. I'm pretty certain that I want to create a Wattpad account so I can start sharing short fiction pieces. I wrote one. I keep writing for this poetry reading that I've been going to just to stay, with it as I'm
Mhm.
editing Childish Things, my next novel. Um, but the most recent short stories I've been doing are because I really liked Ted Chiang's short story collection. That he's the author of what would eventually become the Arrival film, um, and
Nice.
he's really good at humanizing the sci-fi. So
Yeah.
taking interesting sci-fi.
Arrival's very human. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. And yeah, it talks about language and time and how those concepts,
Family. Yeah.
yeah, how we are able to accept things and how we would think differently if we had a larger, if our mind was expanded to realize more of the beauty of life and things like that. So because of that, I've been writing some pretty weird stuff, and one of those things
Wonderful.
was a story about two brothers from Iran who start working at a college, and they both kind of monitor this basically like exhaust system for um, a super collider,
Hmm.
and um, there's something that goes terribly wrong, um, and so I think that'll be the first story that I post. But I think I'm going to be using White Devil as the kind of brand name for this collection that I put out.
Oh,
Um,
neat.
so
Hmm.
that'll be coming shortly, and so that'll give you a taste of my fiction. But as of right now, Can Enable is available for free on Kindle Unlimited if you have Kindle. Also,
Oh, very
for
nice.
those of you who don't know, it's something that I don't know how many people or how much Amazon does to make this known. But Kindle is an app as well as a device. So if you would like to read Kindle books on your phone, um, we're all shut in. So if if you want to get some reading done, now's the time.
Yeah.
You can just download Kindle on your phone. Uh, I'm assuming it's available on iPhone, but I have it on my Android. So it's free right now for Kindle Unlimited, and it's also free on Audiobook if you want to do an Audible free trial, um, and $14.95 after that.
Oh,
Also,
nice.
$9.99 in paperback.
Did
Um,
you read it?
uh,
Yeah. Who did the audio? Just curious.
Oh yeah, so no, it was thankfully enough there were some readers that um agreed to
Oh,
just take
cool.
royalty, like it's basically royalty sharing. Um and it was a group, or it was a duo, I guess I should say. There was this one voice, Trip um, Trip Warren, I believe is the name of the male, and Annie Lena Day. And it's interesting because I have dual perspectives for the two male leads, and then there's a few chapters that are the female lead, Beth. And so what was interesting is that I didn't even realize that he had kind of like this deal worked out with Annie, but when he went to approach me, he was like, "Oh, I have this partner, and we work on books together. Would you like us both to do this book?" And I'm like, "Oh, wow, that's amazing! Like I can have somebody, basically do the book justice, where there's, voice actors for each part. Um, and so that was really awesome to
That's
have.
fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. And they did an amazing job doing the audiobook. So I'm really proud of the work that I put in, not just that, but the work that they put in as well. So if you'd like to read, it's a coming of age story about a young man who survives a near death experience and kind of starts to believe that because um, he survived this prolonged hospital stay as a child, that
Hmm.
God must have this grandiose plan for him. And then, shortly he realizes that, the mundanity of life is much more um, of a burden or of a challenge than having some kind of, grandiose adventure.
Yeah.
And it's taking that can enable framework and applying it to a nerdy handicapped kid who feels kind of put upon and feels like he's destined for greatness, but nobody really uh, is expecting much from him, and a jock who is the star of his high school football team, but he actually really is jealous of Dennis, the main character, because he feels like people actually expect a lot. Like there's this grass is always greener on the other side thing that's the center of the story, and both of them kind of wish they could be the other person because they think that the other person has the respect that they want.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's kind of following them throughout their
Totally.
lives
Yeah.
and seeing how their rivalry turns out. And so yeah, so and this is part of a series where I'm hoping to do different adaptations of kind of taking the core dramatic element from um, biblical narratives and just kind of exploring those more deeply. So they're not necessarily um, it's not necessarily a companion series where it's like biblical study. It's just more taking Bible stories that have meant a lot to me and kind of taking some kind of element from them and expanding on them. Um, and I started with Cain and Abel. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, so I'm hoping
That's lovely.
you
Yeah.
guys check it out and look forward to more shortly.
Yeah. It's nice to see like you're really going. It sounds like we have a similar kind of philosophical framework where we need to take opposing characters and we need to put them uh, in different circumstances, but have them kind of mashed together in a way that's going to thematically drive things. Just the substance of storytelling. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks
Cool.
for listening. We enjoy having you here. And if you're listening to this later, be sure to drop any questions that you have. Um, we're at the threshold now where we can be a little bit more individual, to give more individual attention, and we always appreciate people that are interested in learning more about philosophy or storytelling or anything that really we bring up. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, yeah. And thanks again for checking out this episode. And please give us a like and a subscribe on your way out. We'd appreciate that, whether you're listening to this live or later. We do this once a week, every Monday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So you can expect that. And yeah, we'll be having more episodes in the future. So thanks again for checking us out, and we'll talk to you guys later.
Bye bye.